The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie as Margaret found herself bound to the wooden fence post, her wrists aching from the rough rope that held her there. She had been walking the old trail that connected the neighboring towns when the group of men had surrounded her, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. "Please help me," she called out as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "I haven't done anything wrong." The men who had tied her there spoke in hushed tones about missing livestock and strange occurrences around town. They pointed fingers and made accusations based on nothing more than the fact that she was different. She was a woman who lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of town, who knew about herbs and healing, who kept to herself most days. Thomas heard her cries from across the field where he had been tending to his horses. The 67-year-old rancher had spent his entire life on this land, and had seen many things come and go. He recognized fear when he heard it, and something deep in his chest told him this wasn't right. He mounted his faithful horse Belle, a mare he had raised from a foal, and rode steadily toward the commotion. His weathered hands gripped the reins gently, the way they had. For decades his back was straight despite the years, and his eyes held the quiet wisdom that comes from a lifetime of watching and learning. As he approached the scene, Thomas saw the woman tied to the fence post, and the group of men standing nearby, arguing among themselves. He recognized most of them townspeople he had known for years. Good men, usually. But fear had a way of making people do things they wouldn't normally consider. "What's happening here?" Thomas asked as he dismounted, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through years of honest living. The men turned toward him, and their leader, Jake Morrison, stepped forward. Jake was a merchant who had moved to town 5 years ago and had been quick to stir up trouble whenever something went wrong. "This woman here," Jake said, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret, "has been causing all sorts of problems. Missing cattle, strange lights near her cabin at night. People are scared." Thomas, and rightfully so, Thomas looked at the woman tied to the post. Her clothes were simple but clean. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, and despite her tears, her eyes held a dignity that spoke of inner strength. He had seen her before in town, always polite, always keeping to herself, never causing any trouble that he could see. "Have you seen her steal anything?" Thomas asked the group. "Have any of you actually witnessed her doing something wrong?" The men shifted uncomfortably and looked at each other. Jake's face grew red as he struggled to find words. "Well, no, not exactly, but strange things have been happening ever since she moved here. The cattle disappearing, the sick children getting better after she visits. People say she practices dark arts." Thomas stepped closer to Margaret and looked into her eyes. He saw fear, yes, but also something else. Something pure and good that reminded him of his late wife, Eleanor, who had also been misunderstood because she was different, because she was educated, because she spoke her mind. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. Margaret Fletcher," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Thomas. I own the ranch just south of town. Tell me, Margaret, what really happened." Here Margaret took a shaky breath and began to speak. "The men said their cattle were missing and they blamed me. I tried to explain that I saw them yesterday evening wandering toward Miller's Creek, but they wouldn't listen. They said I was lying, that I must have done something to make them disappear." Thomas nodded and turned back to the group. "Miller's Creek, you say? That's where my cattle ended up last month when a section of fence came down in that storm. Remember? Jake, I found them there 2 days later. None the worse for where." Jake's expression faltered, but he pressed on. "Even so, there are other things. The Henderson boy was deathly ill, and then suddenly he was better, right after she visited. Some say she made a deal with dark forces." Margaret's tears flowed more freely now, and Thomas felt his heart ache for her. He remembered when Eleanor had been accused of similar things simply because she had studied books and knew about medicine and healing. "Margaret," Thomas said softly, "what did you do for the Henderson boy?" "Brought him willow bark tea," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I learned about it from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother before that. It helps with fever and pain. I've used it many times. My grandmother always said, knowledge of healing was a gift to be shared, not hidden." Thomas smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. His own grandmother had known about willow bark too. and had used it to help neighbors and family whenever someone fell ill. It was old wisdom passed down through generations, nothing dark or mysterious about it. He walked over to his horse and retrieved a knife from his saddlebag. The men tensed as he approached Margaret, but Thomas ignored them and carefully cut the ropes that bound her wrists. Margaret rubbed her freed hands together, wincing as feeling returned to them. Thomas offered her his canteen and she drank gratefully. "Now then," Thomas said, turning back to the group, "I want to tell you all something, and I want you to listen carefully, Margaret. Here reminds me of someone very special, someone I lost 3 years ago." The men grew quiet, sensing the gravity in Thomas's voice. "My wife Eleanor was a lot like Margaret. She was educated. She read books. She knew about herbs and healing. She helped people whenever she could, delivered babies, tended the sick, taught children to read. But there were always some who didn't understand her, who feared what they didn't know." Thomas's voice grew softer as he remembered Eleanor's gentle hands as she tended to wounded animals, her patient voice as she taught their grandchildren to read, her quiet strength that had sustained their family through difficult times. "Fear does strange things to people," Thomas continued. "It makes us see threats where there are none. It makes us forget our better nature, forget the kindness our mothers and fathers taught us." He looked each man in the eye, making sure his words reached them. "Margaret here has done nothing but try to help. She used old family knowledge to ease a child's suffering. She noticed where your missing cattle might be found. She lives quietly and bothers no one. Yet you tied her to a fence post like a common criminal." The men began to shift uncomfortably, some looking down at their boots, others glancing at each other with dawning realization. Jake, however, was not ready to back down. "But Thomas, you don't understand the things people have seen. The strange lights." Margaret spoke up, then her voice clear despite her earlier tears. "The lights come from my lamp as I work late into the night. Grinding herbs and preparing medicines, I often work by lamplight, because that's when I have time after my daily chores are done. There's nothing strange or mysterious about it." Thomas nodded and added, "I've seen those same lights in Eleanor's kitchen many nights when she was preparing remedies for sick animals or making tinctures for the winter months. Light through a window at night can seem mysterious if you don't know what's behind it." One of the younger men in the group spoke up hesitantly. "My mother used to make willow bark tea when I was small. It always helped when I had fever." Another man added quietly, "She did help the Henderson boy and he did get better." Maybe we were too quick to judge. Jake looked around at his companions and saw doubt creeping into their faces. His authority was slipping away, and with it his chance to be seen as the leader who had solved the town's problems. "Even if that's true," Jake said desperately, "there are still the missing cattle." Thomas mounted his horse again and gestured toward the direction of Miller's Creek. "Why don't we all ride over there right now and see if we can find them? I'm willing to bet they're grazing peacefully by the water, just like mine were last month." The group agreed somewhat reluctantly, and they made their way across the prairie. Thomas helped Margaret up onto Belle behind him, and they rode together toward the creek. The sun was higher now, and the morning air was warming, as it often did in late spring. As they crested a small hill, the creek came into view, and there, grazing contentedly in the tall grass beside the water, were a dozen cattle bearing Jake's brand. They looked up lazily as the riders approached, then went back to their grazing, clearly undisturbed and healthy. Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The other men looked relieved, but also ashamed of their earlier actions. Thomas dismounted and helped Margaret down, then walked over to examine the fence line. "Here's your problem," Thomas called out, pointing to a section where the fence posts had shifted, leaving a gap wide enough for cattle to wander through. "Looks like the spring rains loosened the soil and the posts shifted. It happens more often than you'd think." The men gathered around to look at the evidence, and the truth of the situation became clear. The cattle had simply wandered through the gap in the fence, following their natural instincts to find water and fresh grass. There was no theft, no mysterious disappearance, just a common occurrence that happened on ranches throughout the territory. Jake stood apart from the group, his dreams of being seen as a problem solver crumbling around him. Thomas approached him with understanding rather than anger. "It's easy to jump to conclusions when things go wrong," Thomas said quietly. We all want to protect what's ours, and sometimes that desire can cloud our judgment. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes. Jake nodded reluctantly, though his pride was clearly wounded. I suppose I owe Margaret an apology. That would be the right thing to do. Thomas agreed, as the group prepared to head back to town Margaret's way.